Leon Vargas, once a celebrated CEO, now a ghost in the criminal underworld, was reborn in 1992 with one mission: to hunt down the syndicate that destroyed his life and claim a ruthless revenge no one saw coming. Leon Vargas had lived most of his life believing that success was the strongest shield a man could build. As the celebrated CEO of Vargatech Industries, he stood at the top of a towering empire of innovation. International magazines praised his vision, investors trusted every decision he made, and governments invited him to global conferences. His confident image never showed the long nights, the battles for market dominance, or the silent enemies waiting in the shadows. To the world, he was unstoppable. To those who studied him carefully, he was a threat that needed to be removed. The first sign of danger appeared quietly. A sudden report leaked online accusing Vargatech of manipulating finances. The numbers looked real, the documents seemed authentic, and the timing was perfect. Leon had no idea that these files were planted long before they surfaced. He believed it was the work of jealous competitors until the second wave of attacks hit within hours. Banks froze his corporate accounts, government agencies opened multiple investigations, and his board members began distancing themselves from him. It all happened so fast that Leon barely had time to understand what was happening. Inside his office, he watched his reputation collapse in real time. Screens showed news anchors discussing his downfall, stock prices crashing, and former allies making statements to protect themselves. Leon kept digging into the accusations, convinced it was a coordinated hit. Every clue pointed toward a sophisticated syndicate operating far beyond the reach of normal criminals. They knew exactly how to damage him without leaving a clear trail. He realized he was facing an enemy who had studied him through every phase of his career. Within days, the empire he had spent years building began to crack. Investors pulled out, employees resigned, and projects worth millions were suddenly abandoned. Internally, panic spread through his company. Externally, the media painted him as a greedy manipulator who had fooled everyone for years. Even people who once called him a genius now treated him as a criminal. Leon tried to defend himself, but the forces working against him were stronger, faster, and far more prepared. When the arrest warrant arrived, Leon knew it was no longer about money or business. Someone wanted him erased completely. He attempted to escape the city using a private route only a few trusted individuals knew about. That choice sealed his fate. As his car sped down an isolated road that night, a silent signal was sent to a device hidden beneath the engine. The explosion that followed lit up the dark forest like a brief sunrise, swallowing the vehicle in a wave of fire. No one survived long enough to ask questions. News outlets announced his death with dramatic headlines and cold summaries of his downfall. The same people who once praised him now treated his end as a cautionary tale. The world believed the story was over. Yet somewhere beyond the moment of destruction, Leon's consciousness drifted into a darkness that felt strangely familiar. Something waited for him on the other side, something that would pull him back into a life that had already ended. Leon opened his eyes to a room that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, illuminating a space frozen in time. Posters of early 90s bands lined the walls. A rotary phone sat untouched on the desk, and the calendar on the wall boldly displayed the year, 1992. At first, he thought he had been hallucinating, that the explosion had scrambled his mind. But as he moved, he noticed details only someone who had lived the past decades would know. Every scratch on the wooden floor, every faded sticker on the drawer, every smell of the old carpet, they all screamed authenticity. He was not dreaming. He had been returned to the very year before his life fell apart. Confusion gripped him at first. He remembered the pain of betrayal, the collapse of his empire, the explosion that had ended his life. And now, somehow, all of it existed as a warning, a chance to rewrite the past. The possibilities were terrifying. If this was real, If he truly had all of his memories intact from the future, he held knowledge that no one else could possess. He could predict moves, avoid traps, and even prevent the syndicate that had destroyed him from rising to power. But with that knowledge came a cold realization. There would be no second chances for mistakes. Every step he took in this timeline had to be calculated. The first hours were a blur of observation and cautious movement. He checked newspapers, watched TV broadcasts, and retraced familiar streets, confirming that this world was indeed younger, less developed, and dangerously naive. People he knew in the future were only children or absent entirely, and corporations that once dominated the skyline were still in their infancy. The city, innocent and unaware, seemed fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter the delicate balance he now navigated. Leon felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility pressing down on him. He realized quickly that he could not return to his old corporate life. Any attempt to reclaim a position in business would expose him, draw attention, and possibly alert the very forces that had tried to kill him. Instead, he needed a cover, a new identity that allowed him to observe, infiltrate, and manipulate from the shadows. The knowledge of what was to come made him dangerous in ways the people around him could not comprehend. He began studying the criminal networks, minor gangs, and underground connections that existed in this version of the city. Every person, every hierarchy, every secret path could be used as a stepping stone toward his ultimate revenge. Yet there was also a strange thrill in this second chance. In the first life, he had been bound by rules, legality, and public image. Now, he could bend the world to his will, shape events with precision, and move with impunity. The thought of becoming more than a victim ignited a fire in him, a ruthless focus that made the memory of the past explosion feel like a distant nightmare. Leon knew that the rebirth was no accident. It was an opportunity for retribution, a chance to rise not only as a man of power, but as something far more dangerous, a master of the game, untouchable and inevitable. As the day faded into evening, Leon made a silent vow to himself. He would not just survive this second life. He would rewrite history. He would ensure that those who betrayed him in the future would never even imagine the reckoning that awaited them. In the quiet of the room, surrounded by remnants of the past, Leon's rebirth began not as a man seeking to reclaim what was lost, but as a force preparing to dominate a world that had no idea he had returned. Leon understood quickly that the streets held the kind of lessons that boardrooms never could. Without his previous empire, without all eyes or influence, he had nothing but his mind, his knowledge of the future, and the drive to survive. He began observing the local gangs, small-time operators who thought themselves untouchable, running petty crimes with confidence born of ignorance. Their leaders were arrogant, predictable, and careless, exactly the kind of people Leon could manipulate. Every pattern, every habit, every rivalry became a piece of a larger puzzle. He did not intend to fight them immediately. First, he had to understand the rules of this world, the way power flowed through its veins, and the weaknesses that could be exploited. Leon started small. He offered help in solving disputes that threatened gang operations, not by brute force, but by strategic intervention. He predicted moves, anticipated betrayals, and devised plans that made him seem indispensable. Slowly, respect was earned not through money or weapons, but through intelligence. Rumors spread about a quiet strategist who always seemed to be one step ahead, whose ideas saved operations from disaster. No one knew his real identity, but everyone recognized the results. Leon realized that fear and respect could coexist if handled correctly. One intimidated those who opposed him. The other drew loyalty from those who needed guidance. Within weeks, he had built a web of influence across multiple factions. Minor gang leaders began seeking him out, valuing his counsel above their old methods. When conflicts arose, he intervened, turning potential rivals into allies and allies into loyal followers. His knowledge of future technologies, trends, and human behavior gave him a unique edge. He suggested strategies that seemed like intuition to others, but were the result of decades of foresight. What had once been instinct and survival in the corporate world now translated seamlessly into street power. Leon realized that this new life required not strength alone, but the ability to manipulate, control, and foresee outcomes that no one else could. As his reputation grew, so did the attention of dangerous people. Other gangs, threatened by his rising influence, began testing him. Ambushes were set, operations sabotaged, and alliances questioned. Yet Leon navigated each challenge with surgical precision. Every attack he faced became an opportunity to learn and adapt. Unlike the chaotic battles he had seen in the streets before, Leon's moves were deliberate, calculated, and devastating in their simplicity. He never relied on sheer violence. He relied on understanding patterns, exploiting mistakes, and turning each conflict to his advantage. The city began to whisper about the strategist who had no past, yet seemed to control events with uncanny foresight. By the end of the year, Leon had transformed from an unknown observer into a figure of quiet dominance. He was no longer the naive newcomer, but a rising force whose intellect rivaled any weapon. The gangs, once fractured and unpredictable, began functioning under his subtle guidance. He had taken the first steps toward power in a world that had never expected him to rise there. Yet even as he solidified control, he knew this was only the beginning. The syndicate that had destroyed his life in the future remained untouched, and his plans for revenge required more than local influence. He had built the foundation, but the real war, the one that would reclaim his life and crush his enemies, was still ahead. Every calculated move, every silent victory, was a preparation for the ruthless reckoning that was coming, a reckoning that would change the city forever. Leon understood that alliances were not built on strength alone, they were built on trust, opportunity, and timing. In this timeline, a forgotten crime group operated on the fringes of the city, a faction that had once held influence, but collapsed due to betrayal and mismanagement. In his previous life, Leon had known this group only in passing, a minor footnote compared to the syndicate that destroyed him. Now, with knowledge of their mistakes and failures, he saw potential. If he could rebuild them from the ground up, he could gain loyal allies who would owe him everything. The group, cautious and wary of outsiders, seemed doomed to fade into obscurity. But Leon's arrival was quiet, subtle, and impossible to ignore. He observed their routines for weeks, noting leaders' habits, internal rivalries, and the lingering distrust that had caused their downfall. Unlike the impulsive, violent strategies of many street gangs, Leon approached with precision. He fixed minor problems before they became crises, eliminated sources of internal tension, and created opportunities for the members to prove themselves. Slowly, the group began to stabilize. They had learned to survive, but now they were learning to thrive again. Leon's knowledge of the future gave him a unique advantage. He knew which allies would betray them, which territories would become valuable, and which moves the rival gangs would attempt next. Every intervention he made seemed almost prescient, earning him respect and loyalty without a single show of brute force. The group's revival had consequences. Members who had once been divided began working together under Leon's guidance. Past grudges were set aside as he carefully manipulated outcomes to demonstrate that unity was not only possible but profitable. He taught them methods to avoid detection, secure their operations, and expand influence subtly, all while maintaining a low profile. The forgotten gang, once a shadow of its former self, began regaining strength and visibility. The city began to take notice, not of Leon himself, but of the group that seemed reborn overnight, guided by an invisible hand. Leon also understood the power of timing. By carefully choosing when and where to intervene, he avoided drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rival syndicates. Each successful move reinforced his reputation, making the group seem like a force of fate rather than a collection of struggling criminals. He had turned what was once a failed, vulnerable faction into a rising power, capable of challenging other gangs and holding its ground in the city's underground world. Every member now saw him not only as a strategist, but as the reason for their survival and resurgence. Yet even as he strengthened the group, Leon never lost sight of the ultimate goal, the syndicate that had destroyed his original life. This reborn gang would serve as the foundation of his power, a tool to infiltrate and dismantle enemies who had once been untouchable. By resurrecting a faction others had written off, Leon had created leverage, allies, and protection. The city, unaware of the man guiding these events, began shifting in ways only he could predict. His careful orchestration of the forgotten group was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a statement that power could rise from the ashes if wielded with intelligence, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. Leon had not just restored a gang. He had set the stage for a war that would eventually reach the highest levels of the criminal world, a war only he was prepared to win. Leon's focus shifted from building power to gathering intelligence. The syndicate that had ruined his life in the original timeline remained a shadowy, untouchable force, but he now had the means to uncover its secrets. With the gang he had rebuilt serving as both shield and eyes on the street, he began a methodical campaign to expose the network that had orchestrated his downfall. Every corner of the city, every corrupt official, every hidden deal became a piece of a puzzle he was determined to solve. He knew that knowledge alone would not be enough. It had to be precise, actionable, and devastating. He began by tracing the syndicate's financial operations. Using contacts in banks, smuggling routes, and underground trading, Leon mapped out every connection, every branch of influence. What appeared to outsiders as small, isolated transactions revealed patterns of corruption that reached the highest levels of business and government. Politicians, police officers, and even corporate executives were all part of the same hidden network. Leon recognized names, locations, and methods from his past life, and with each discovery, he documented evidence meticulously, ensuring that every piece could be used at the right moment. His approach was surgical, precise, and relentless. Leon also focused on surveillance. Members of his gang were trained to observe, report, and infiltrate without detection. They planted themselves strategically in locations controlled by syndicate members, gathering conversations, photographs, and digital records. Unlike his previous life, where he had relied on intermediaries, this time Leon had control over every step. He could predict reactions, anticipate movements, and manipulate situations with uncanny accuracy. Even those who thought themselves secure and untouchable began to unknowingly expose their weaknesses. The more Leon uncovered, the clearer the syndicate's reach became. He discovered hidden warehouses filled with contraband, unregistered vehicles moving through secret routes, and offshore accounts that financed illegal operations. But it was not only material evidence that mattered. He also gathered proof of betrayals, cover-ups, and manipulations that had destroyed lives, including his own. Each revelation fueled his resolve. Every hidden file, every secret recording, and every illicit transaction became ammunition for the reckoning he planned. At the same time, Leon's understanding of human nature became a weapon. He observed greed, fear, and loyalty within the syndicate's ranks, identifying who could be swayed, who would resist, and who would betray. Small manipulations, misleading rumors, carefully timed conflicts, and subtle pressure began to create fractures within the organization. Members who had once operated as a single unit now second-guessed each other. The syndicate's leaders, unaware of the invisible force dismantling their empire, grew anxious and erratic. By the end of this phase, Leon had transformed from a hunted victim into a strategist orchestrating the exposure of a criminal empire. He had not yet confronted them directly, but he had achieved something equally dangerous: knowledge, leverage, and control. Every secret uncovered, every weakness exposed, brought him one step closer to revenge. The syndicate, so powerful in his previous life, was now vulnerable in ways no one could predict. Leon had turned the shadows into weapons, proving that intelligence and foresight could be deadlier than violence. In this game, every revelation was a move on the chessboard, and he was preparing to deliver a checkmate that the city would never forget. Leon's plan of revenge moved from preparation to action, and the city began to feel the invisible tremors of his strategy. He had spent months carefully mapping the syndicate, understanding its operations, and identifying the people who kept it running. Now, it was time to strike. Unlike the reckless attacks he had seen in the past, Leon's moves were calculated, precise, and devastating. Each operation was designed not only to weaken the syndicate financially, but to erode the trust between its members. He did not rely on chaos. He relied on predictability. Every warehouse hit, every shipment intercepted, and every ally turned against them was a message that a force they could not see had emerged to dismantle their empire. Leon's first wave targeted the syndicate's logistical network. Using his gang's knowledge of the streets, he blocked smuggling routes and disrupted deliveries without leaving a trace of himself. Syndicate leaders initially thought these were random setbacks, mistakes by careless underlings. But when multiple operations failed consecutively, panic set in. Money vanished, shipments were lost, and minor leaders began questioning their security. Each disruption was a controlled storm, designed to make the syndicate feel fragile, vulnerable, and uncertain. Leon watched as fear crept into their ranks, knowing that psychological pressure was just as powerful as physical force. Next, he turned his attention to infiltration. Using the alliances he had formed, Leon planted insiders within the syndicate. These members fed him real-time information, reported plans, and exposed hidden betrayals. The syndicate, which had once operated with confidence and secrecy, now found itself under constant surveillance. Their every move could be anticipated, every decision countered. Leon used this knowledge to manipulate the group into making mistakes, to turn trusted members against one another, and to isolate the leaders from their support networks. His strikes were invisible but unmistakably effective. Leon also exploited the syndicate's overconfidence. Members believed that no one could anticipate their actions, that the chaos of the streets was uncontrollable. Leon used their arrogance against them. He created scenarios that forced them to react in predictable ways, setting traps that seemed accidental but were carefully engineered. Ambushes, financial sabotage, and operational failures appeared random to the outside eye, but were part of a meticulously orchestrated plan. Every setback weakened their internal cohesion, sowed distrust, and forced them to question the loyalty of everyone around them. The turning point came when Leon orchestrated a decisive strike on the syndicate as central operations hub. With insider information and precise timing, his team incapacitated the facility, seizing evidence, cutting off communication, and leaving the leaders disoriented. The syndicate's members, accustomed to dominance and control, were suddenly powerless. Fear and confusion replaced arrogance. Leon had turned the tables completely. The hunters had become the hunted. By the end of these operations, Leon had proven that strategy, intelligence, and foresight were deadlier than brute force. The syndicate, once untouchable, was fractured, vulnerable, and terrified. Leon had not just attacked them. He had dismantled their empire piece by piece, leaving nothing to chance. The city, unaware of the mastermind behind the chaos, began to whisper about a force that could strike without warning, a figure who controlled events from the shadows. Leon was no longer a victim. He had become the predator, and the reckoning had only just begun. Leon knew the final confrontation would require precision, patience, and absolute control. The syndicate, though fractured, still had remnants capable of violent retaliation. They had lost their warehouses, key allies, and financial stability, but their leaders remained dangerous, desperate, and unpredictable. Any mistake could cost him everything. He spent weeks studying their movements, predicting escape routes, and identifying weak points. Every detail mattered: the timing of their meetings, the security of their hideouts, and the loyalty of their remaining members. Failure was not an option. This confrontation was the culmination of years of planning, rebirth, and meticulous strategy. The syndicate's leaders, now paranoid and cornered, attempted to flee the city under the cover of night. Leon anticipated this move long before it happened. Using his network of loyal operatives, he created a chain of surveillance that tracked their every step. Vehicles were monitored, safe houses were observed, and communications intercepted. The leaders thought they were clever, but Leon's foresight turned their every action against them. Each escape attempt was funneled toward a controlled location he had chosen, an abandoned industrial zone at the edge of the city. The isolation of the site ensured no interference from police or rival gangs, and the environment could be manipulated entirely to his advantage. As the leaders arrived, Leon's plan unfolded with ruthless efficiency. He had already set traps to limit their mobility, blocked exit points, and created confusion among their remaining allies. The syndicate members, once confident and commanding, now found themselves surrounded by invisible forces. Their phones had been disabled, escape routes sealed, and communications compromised. Every decision they made played directly into the scenario Leon had orchestrated. The fear that spread among them was palpable. The arrogance that had once shielded them was replaced by uncertainty and panic. In this moment, Leon's presence was felt not through violence, but through the inevitability of his strategy. The confrontation was psychological as much as it was operational. Leon's operatives, positioned strategically, forced the syndicate members to reveal their weaknesses. Secrets, betrayals, and past misdeeds were exposed, creating chaos within their ranks. Leaders argued, alliances fractured further, and old grievances resurfaced. Leon had created a controlled environment where the syndicate was forced to implode under its own weight. Every move he made was calculated to maximize their sense of helplessness, leaving no room for retaliation or recovery. The once powerful organization now appeared like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest pressure. By the time Leon emerged to oversee the final moments, the syndicate leaders were powerless, demoralized, and entirely dependent on his mercy. Their empire, which had once ruled the city through fear and manipulation, had crumbled entirely. Evidence of their crimes, carefully documented by Leon's team, ensured that they could never regain their influence. What remained was the culmination of his meticulous planning, a complete dismantling of those who had destroyed his life, executed with precision and without unnecessary bloodshed. The city, oblivious to the mastermind behind the downfall, remained intact, but a message had been sent. The predator was no longer a shadow. He was an unavoidable force, and anyone who had underestimated him had paid the ultimate price. With the syndicate dismantled and its leaders neutralized, Leon stood at the center of a city that had shifted without even realizing it. He was no longer merely a strategist or a survivor. He had become the architect of a new order. The streets, once chaotic and fragmented, now moved according to a rhythm only he understood. His knowledge of business, combined with his control over the underground, allowed him to create a system of power unlike anything the city had seen. Unlike the ruthless syndicate he had destroyed, Leon's vision was precise, calculated, and enduring. He was no longer driven solely by revenge. He was building an empire that could not be toppled by mere force or greed. Leon carefully integrated his gang's operations with legitimate businesses, creating a web that blended legality with influence. Nightclubs, warehouses, shipping companies, and small enterprises became part of his network. On the surface, they appeared ordinary, mundane even, but each entity served a purpose in his grand design. His operations were invisible to authorities, who saw only ordinary commerce, while he controlled the flow of power behind the scenes. Information, loyalty, and resources were now his most valuable assets. He understood that the city's future was determined not by who wielded weapons, but by who controlled knowledge and influence. His reputation remained a mystery to most. Rumors spread of a strategist who moved unseen, a force capable of controlling events without exposure. Criminals whispered his name in fear, while business leaders unknowingly followed the patterns he had designed. The city had shifted into a silent order, one where his influence determined outcomes before they even happened. Unlike the chaos of his previous life, he now thrived in a system of control, calculation, and foresight. Every decision, from minor deals to strategic expansions, was executed with precision, reinforcing the invisible structure he had built. Yet Leon did not become complacent. The memory of betrayal and the destruction of his past life remained a constant reminder of the stakes. He continued to observe, to learn, and to adapt, knowing that power was never absolute. Each day brought new challenges, new players, and new threats. By combining lessons from the corporate world with the street-level intelligence of his gang, he created a hybrid approach that allowed him to anticipate dangers before they materialized. He was no longer reacting to the world. He was shaping it according to his vision. In this new reign, Leon became more than a criminal, more than a strategist. He became a silent king. His empire was not defined by fear alone, but by structure, loyalty, and inevitability. He had mastered the balance between visibility and secrecy, influence and control, creating a system that was resilient, adaptive, and untouchable. Even those who had once destroyed him in another timeline would have been unable to recognize the force he had become. As the city moved under his unseen hand, Leon understood that this rebirth had been no accident. His return to 1992 had been a second chance, a rare opportunity to rewrite history with clarity, precision, and vengeance. What had begun as a quest for payback had evolved into something far greater: the creation of an empire built on intellect, strategy, and the ruthless understanding of human nature. Leon had become the ultimate master of his fate, proving that a second life could not only redeem, but transform a man into a force that no one could stop. A silent king who ruled not with noise, but with the inevitability of his vision.